Hey, class. So, welcome to week 3. And we're going to be, taking a look at a few things this week. As you can see, we're going to be taking a look at some feminist literature. We got Jewett, Chopin, and Wilkins Freeman. And we're going to be looking at some African American authors like Booker T. Washington and Charles Chestnut. So one thing that I wanted to point out to you is some of the characteristics of feminist literature. And again, we're in realism, but part of that realism, regionalism, naturalism, part of the all that, especially when you think about naturalism, is the unequal distribution of power between not only race but genders at this time. And there is, kind of this oppressive patriarchy largely due to very strict religious, Christianity, some very strict views of it at the time, and there's a pushback. The suffrage movement's coming. The right to vote. But let me just talk about what feminist literature is. Feminist literature, as you can see from this document, portrays characters or ideas that attempt to change gender norms. It tends to examine, question, and argue for change against established and antiquated gender roles through the written word. Feminist literature strives to alter inequalities between genders across societal and political arenas. I don't want to read this whole thing to you, but essentially that's the heart of it. Now, when you look at literature, and then you start to kind of look at it as this feminist literature, what is its characteristics? Basically, most of it describes situations, events where there's a power dynamic between genders. There's Susan Glaspell has a famous short story, and it's also a one-act play, and it has two different titles, but basically in it, one of them's husband is the sheriff, and the other one's husband is some kind of town official, and there's a murder, and they're trying to figure out, like what happened, what's going on, and it's only the women that are able to realize that the woman was being severely beaten and abused, and she in fact killed her husband, and it's the women that kind of convince their husbands that this is indeed they're the ones who discover the truth of it, but then they make the decision to steer their husbands to the way of suicide to kind of control the situation. That's a kind of a good example of the unfair power dynamic. Here you have the women who are, like characteristic two, just as competent or more competent than the men, but societal situations keep them from fulfilling potential. Often feminist literature is written by women, often for women, in dealing with those issues. Women are often showed as being mistreated, and of course, women are almost often the protagonists in feminist literature. So I just wanted to point that out to you as we look at our selections this week, which are just wanted to talk about these selections. And one is Sarah Jewett, and she is from Maine. And her father had 3 daughters. He was a ship captain. He kind of encouraged and indulged their education and open-mindedness and being kind of free-spirited, and that allowed them to really grow. But what she does is she captures themes for women of loneliness and themes that have to deal with mother and daughter relationships a lot in her works. And she also is very good at her aspect of regionalism is depicting the topographies and people and speech patterns and modes of life that are very distinctive to this kind of Maine, New England, kind of area of the Northeast. So that's mainly what she writes about, and which I'm sure that you'll pick up on in The White Heron. Um, let's see. Basically, I guess the way that for instance, one author or critic describes her work is that in this work, bits and pieces of lives of a small group of men and women are quilted into a unified impression of life in a once prosperous shipping village. The strong older women who survive in the region form a female community, which, for many critics, is a hallmark of New England regionalism. So, one of the things you have to realize is going on at the same time in this country is there is just an influx of immigrants from Europe, particularly in the Northeast, from Ireland. Of course, Boston, you're breaking my heart. That's one of the things to think about. And for the predominantly English crowd there who had been used to ruling and mistreating the Irish, that this, of course, could cause some tensions in the New World. All right. Next, we're moving on to Kate Chopin. And Kate Chopin's father was an Irish immigrant. I believe her mother was a French immigrant, if I remember correctly. But Kate Chopin wrote a lot about St. Louis because she lived in Ohio, and then New Orleans because she lived down there later. And one of the main themes that she wrote about was the constant constraint on the natural desires that women have, sexual desires, and the way that they were trampled, destroyed, I don't know, oppressed by traditional social norms, especially Christian norms, of course, because it's a predominantly Christian country at the time. So that's a lot of her kind of themes that she writes about. Let's see. Sorry. I think if I remember right, her husband ended up dying, and she had to raise 6 children, and that gave her very little time to write. So a lot of times she would belt these stories out in a day. She claims, and that they would be essentially finished. But she made here's a quote from the Norton Anthology. She made the Catholic Creoles and Cajuns with their old-fashioned European customs, their witty speech, their sensuous and unself-conscious lives, and rich agricultural landscape of the picturesque parishes familiar to Americans. So she's really bringing you the kind of the New Orleans in the South, as well as, that kind of St. Louis, Ohio kind of area. Um, she writes a lot about anxiety of the loss of family. She's very skillful at depicting characters and advancing them through plots through very distinctive dialogue. Here's another quote. The story of the Canadian ball creates with great economy a believable physical world in which climate and culture and community and individual personalities exist in subtle reciprocal relation. But the hints of scandal and the undercurrent of flirtation of the story are still within conventional limits. She explores these topics, but doesn't quite push it far enough to get in trouble. If you remember, she's also the author of Desiree's Baby and The Awakening. All right. I also have included, if you'll notice, in the content, some websites that have a pretty good bit of I thought there was a little bit of helpful information, as far as what she's written, stuff like that. I thought you might enjoy, or you could at least peruse and take a look at. I also included some notes on the white heron, by the way. All right, our next author is Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. She is most famous for writing about New England, and her themes often explore. I guess she's an Orthodox Congregationalist, which is a kind of Puritan, and she was subject in her life to a strict code of behavior. So a lot of her themes are about the constraints of religious belief and the effect of these constraints on how it forms your character. And see, that's how it ties into realism and naturalism and regionalism. So that's a lot of what she wrote about. She went to the same school, religious female seminary, as Emily Dickinson, but 20 years later. And there was something that went on in the school. I'm not quite sure about it, but they made you take some kind of crazy religious oath, and a lot of people resisted it, and she kind of got in trouble for doing so as well. Um, let's see. I don't want to go too much into her personal life, but basically, she writes a lot about Massachusetts Bay colonists, so a lot of that regionalism. One of her main themes is the potentiality for unpredictable revolt in ostensibly meek and downtrodden natures. Uh, let's see. Here's a quote about the New England nun that might be beneficial to you. The pervasive theme of psychic oppression and rebellion of women is constant. At the same time that she provides a vivid sense of place, like personality type, Freeman also gives us her best work and insight into the individual psychology and interior life produced when confining inherited codes of village life are subject to the pressure of rapidly changing secular and urban world. And again, it's about those who are just tired of a patriarchy that's just so overwhelmingly oppressive. All right. Next author I want to talk about briefly is Booker T. Washington. And Booker T. Washington was pretty cool guy, pretty interesting guy. Um, his mother had been a slave, and his father had been some white man. They don't know who it was. Um, he held a lot of jobs, and then, of course, like many slaves at this time, or former slaves, or went and found education in these colleges and became like teachers and principals and all kinds of stuff. And I guess he's most famous thing that we're looking at here that he wrote is. Uh, is from an address that he did in Atlanta in 1895 called the Atlanta Exposition. And this speech has been known as the Atlanta Compromise. And basically, you can imagine what it's about. It's about, oppression. It's about, economic opportunity. It's about um, equality. It's about all kinds of things. Um, so this is a section from a larger book, but you're going to see some of the same themes that you see with, of course, Charles Chestnut, and and some of these other authors, but they come about it, very, very different ways. While Booker T. Washington's works are a little bit more philosophical and a little bit more in the tone of like Martin Luther King, you have Charles Chestnut who is arguing, pointing out some similar things, but he's doing it in a completely different way. Instead of a straightforward political speech, you have Charles Chestnut who writes in a regional dialect folktale type of tradition. This is extremely like Uncle Remus, Joel Chandler Harris's works, where you have this narrator, and you have like instead of Uncle Remus, you have Uncle Julius, like a reality-wise old slave um, who has learned not only to survive but use and defeat his supposed superiors, his oppressors, through a mocking mass of ignorance. And but he really knows, what's going on. And you have this kind of narrator, this picturesque stereotype of kind of an older African American who's easygoing and really heavy Southern dialect and settings in these stories. And he kind of combines Caribbean and West African conjure hoodoo with Christianity, as many people did. There was this like element of spirituality that came from tribal, Africa that got kind of magic that got kind of blended with ideas of Christianity. And it shows up a lot in literature. Some of the themes that he does is he talks about the obligation of upwardly mobile African Americans to remember and honor their collective past and to help out those struggling. And he also explores the theme of mixed blood marriages a lot because he was of mixed race, and he even took a long time to reveal to his readers, to the country, that he was in fact part black, and he was one of the first guys who was taken seriously as both a regional writer who wrote these heavy dialects, and then as also a writer who could write, in other ways, kind of like Booker T. Washington. He could write, political type speeches and stuff like that. So again, you're looking for elements of regionalism and these things and naturalism in here, but you also have this new feminism that's popping up, and you also have these people who are descendants of slaves or former slaves who are writing. So I want you to look at how they write and how those characteristics fit in to what we already know about regionalism. Thank you.